All right, hi everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting an overview of my doctoral research on the topic Persemes Science Fiction and the Modular Human, Imagining Genetically Modified People in Bioethics. This presentation is structured as an overview of the manuscript in my thesis. After a brief overview of human genome editing and the unique difficulties that it poses for ethicists, I'll discuss some patterns in the way that we tend to imagine genetically modified people and how they shape the ethical issues we discuss and our approaches to solving them. In the first two papers, I look at which characteristics bioethicists tend to discuss changing in future people and how we tend to portray the units of hypothetical people, which I will label Persemes, as modular components. In the last paper, I'll look at alternative images of human creation from science fiction in order to question whether these can help us think more creatively and in greater detail about future people. I'll also make occasional reference to studies that I conducted that aren't included in the thesis, but that help to flesh out its findings. I first became interested in the ethics of human genome editing because the development of CRISPR technology was leading to speculation about its use in human embryos. I registered for the 2018 International Summit on Human Genome Editing in Hong Kong and unexpectedly got a front row seat to Chinese scientist He Jiankui's announcement that he'd used CRISPR to genetically modify 3 babies with HIV-positive fathers, trying to make a deletion in the CCR5 gene in order to make them more resistant to the virus. Although this event brought a lot of popular attention to the governance of human germline genome editing, this debate has actually been ongoing for more than 60 years. Scientists, theologians, bioethicists, philosophers, legal scholars, and more have discussed many possible ethical issues arising from both therapeutic and enhancement uses of genome editing, ranging from safety risks to the autonomy of children and parents, to affordability, to treating children as consumer products, to increasing stigma based on genetics. Some authors point out that genome editing is not necessary to choose children's traits because adoption and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis already exist, but others think it might be used by parents who wish to avoid discarding unused embryos, who are unable to produce embryos without a health condition, or who wish to make many edits at the same time, or to introduce brand new variants into their children. In order to familiarize myself with these ethical issues, I began my project with a scoping review of literature on the topic. I observed that many scholars describe the debate on human germline gene editing as something like a shouting match in which stakeholders with different convictions collided rather than achieving constructive dialogue, and began to wonder why there had been little progress. Many authors have mentioned issues that could help explain why there is so much of what Michael J. Sandel called moral vertigo in the debate. These include a lack of shared understandings of important concepts like dignity, the sense of human genetic modification as a pivotal moment in evolution that draws intense emotions and comparisons to science fiction, mythology, and historical abuses, awkward vocabulary that does not properly capture stakeholders' views and raises more categorization problems than it solves, a lack of relevant experiences to orient ourselves, a poor fit with deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics alike, the possibility of creating people who no longer share the same ethical frameworks as us, practical biases in favor of laissez-faire reproductive decision-making, and the over-reliance on institutionalized perspectives of scientists and mainstream bioethicists over scholars from other fields, from representatives of vulnerable communities, and from the public more broadly. I think there's an underlying issue that runs beneath many of these problems, and it has to do with the difficulty of theorizing about people and scenarios who exist in our imagination of the future. Dan Callahan once wrote that before discussing bioethics, we need to consider our underlying images of humanity and the way they influence our priorities and emotional commitments. Such images are unique compared to other areas of bioethics because they involve imagining future people who may not be the same as us biologically or psychologically. By examining the way that people conceptualize hypothetical, genetically modified people, we may be able to better understand the impediments to the debate and to question whether we are asking the right ethical questions in the first place. I hypothesized that one of the main reasons germline genome editing is difficult for bioethicists is that the speculative future-focused discourse leads authors to rely on abstract and conventionalized images of future people. Rather than accurately anticipating the scientific possibilities, they imagine designers selecting and combining a conventional short list of isolated characteristics, such as intelligence, morality, or height. This framework is dependent on the contingent, historical, technological, and cultural context in which the debate developed, and it can make it more difficult for stakeholders who do not have the same assumptions to share their views using the ethical vocabulary of mainstream bioethics. Based on this hypothesis, I outlined 5 main goals for my project. First, I would conduct a meta-narrative synthesis review of publications on the ethics of human germline genome editing, collecting data on how future uses of the technology have been examined by different disciplines and stakeholder groups, and how these images developed over the course of the debate. Second, I would analyze which genetic modifications were discussed at different time periods and why the standard set of modifications changed in different social and technological contexts. Third, I would draw on social psychology and cognitive sociology to develop a conceptual synthesis, modeling how stakeholders from different backgrounds envision human germline genome editing. Fourth, I would examine how these models lead the scholars who follow them to discuss certain ethical, social, and political issues, and to employ certain ethical theories when addressing them, while potentially obscuring other approaches. Fifth, I would examine which alternative frameworks for imagining genetically modified people might help us think more creatively and inclusively in this increasingly important debate. This project was supported by a doctoral award from CIHR. For the literature review, I began by examining statements, reports, books, articles, and conference proceedings published in English since the beginning of the debate, and how they imagine genetic modification, genetically modified people, and the futures in which they might exist. In order to be thorough, I used a snowballing procedure that ensured I read every relevant work cited by at least 2 separate texts that had previously been identified, resulting in a corpus that included over 750 works. As part of my critical reading process, I recorded which characteristics authors imagined changing, when they imagined this happening, which cultural references like science fiction or religion they used to illustrate their claims, and other textual evidence about the language and imagery that scholars use to articulate their visions of the future. I then mapped the research field to place findings to the historical context of each scholarly tradition and identify potential influences on the process of change. Finally, I developed a narrative conceptual synthesis drawing on social psychology, science fiction studies, and other resources as needed to explain how the images I studied had affected the debate. In the following slides, I'll begin to discuss my findings. The first thing I need to talk about is that human germline genome editing is usually described in one of 3 modes in the bioethical debate. The first involves talking about changes on the molecular level, such as the claim that He Jiankui tried to make a deletion in a gene called CCR5. The debate has lasted in some form for around 100 years, and this language only became available to scientists once relevant genes were identified. Yet, even now that we are familiar with many specific variants, this is not the most common approach. Another common way of referring to genome editing is through the overarching purpose of the modification. These are most frequently presented as career choices or roles within society that parents or governments might want to secure for their children through genetic modification. The most commonly mentioned of these are musicians, athletes, and soldiers. However, the most frequent way that scholars discuss human germline genome editing involves talking about the different kinds of characteristics that the scientist is trying to change in the genetically modified person. There are many different options available to scientists, and this slide displays some of the traits that scientists have claimed to be at least partly heritable using data from genome-wide association studies. These include plenty of traits that even lay people would agree are socially constructed in some way, from being the victim of a crime to marriage satisfaction to owning a hybrid car. Many even mirror the broad set of traits studied by eugenics advocates in the early 20th century, including phenomena like achieving a prestigious job or getting divorced. But despite the vast number of options, bioethicists and other stakeholders in the germline gene editing debate tend to focus on a fairly small number of characteristics when imagining future people, and these don't seem to correspond to scientific plausibility. Most of them are displayed in the 17 bubbles on this slide. The vast majority of genetic modifications given as examples in the debate consist of references to eye color, height, resistance to Alzheimer's, longer lifespan, hair color, resistance to infectious diseases, creativity, obedience, personality, memory, strength, skin color, intelligence, musical talent, beauty, morality, or brand new abilities from other species, such as photosynthesis or breathing underwater. In one of the articles I published as a result of this research, I proposed that we could refer to these as Persemes, similar to the way in which ideologemes describe basic units of ideological analysis and mythemes describe units of narrative structure. Persemes describe the imagined units of difference for hypothetical people. This allows us to avoid terms like phenotypes or traits, which have technical meanings in biology and social psychology, and import ontological assumptions from those fields, despite the fact that these links are not reflected in the ways that most stakeholders talk about hypothetical people. The fact that only a small short list of Persemes are commonly mentioned in the debate has significant implications. When writing about the difference between treating or enhancing future people, for example, it matters whether your underlying mental image of enhancement is mental or physical, intelligence or personality, strength or sex appeal. This means that, if reproductive genome editing becomes increasingly likely, we need to consider what factors lead stakeholders to discuss some persons over others, and whether we've missed any important ethical issues because certain kinds of modification were overlooked for arbitrary reasons. In my article, From Goodness to Good Looks, I examined which persons were mentioned at different stages of the debate and what influences might be responsible. I divided the timeline of the debate into sections with similar numbers of publications, using notable events as breaking points. The first group of 87 documents ended just before the 1975 Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA and began with J.B.S. Haldane's 1923 book, Daedalus. In the early debate, when authors were still frequently promoting or responding to the idea of reform eugenics, the majority of books and articles discussed intelligence and health, followed by moral enhancement and other psychological changes, shown here in blue. Non-therapeutic physical persons, shown here in yellow, were significantly less common. Scholars often wrote about the top three categories as a sort of trinity. For instance, the 1939 Geneticists Manifesto, published in Nature, drafted by future Nobel Prize winner H.J. Muller, and signed by other famous figures like J.B.S. Haldane, Julian Huxley, and Theodosius Dobzhansky, listed health, intelligence, and fellow feeling as the most important uses of gene editing. Similarly, in 1963, Francis Crick listed good health, high intelligence, and general benevolence as the modifications he thought everyone could agree on providing to future generations. This pattern could be explained as a schema, an abstract knowledge structure of the relationships between different concepts. Schemas can include objects, events, or, to quote some examples from Susan Fiske, human stereotypes like nerd, jock, or untrustworthy politician. They guide our expectations of which categories should be associated with which personal characteristics and vice versa. Authors in the early debate may have discussed some modifications more frequently because their schema of a genetically modified person centered on intelligence, health, and moral enhancement. Since schemas are based on experience, and there were no genetically modified people yet, these expectations had to have come from somewhere else. Authors could have been influenced by the work of previous writers, the sorts of persons they felt were relevant to their discipline, other technologies, exposure to science fiction, perceived likelihood, and many other influences. As these experiences changed, so did the schemas. I'll illustrate this by skipping forward to the final period in my study. The graph on the right shows genetic modifications discussed in 144 documents in the final time period of my study, which started in 2012 when Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier's breakthrough paper on CRISPR was published. Although health and intelligence switch places, they maintain their position at the top throughout the study. However, the most notable difference is that physical persons rose and mental ones fell. Cosmetic persons like eye color, hair color, and attractiveness were mentioned about twice as often, replacing references to compassion as the third category in the putative trinity. References to morality disappeared almost completely from consensus statements, and when I looked at recent surveys of public opinion about different genetic modifications, not one asked about moral enhancement. This is particularly striking because many past and contemporary philosophers support moral enhancement. In contrast, cosmetic persons seem to have joined the central schema without anyone seriously arguing that humans needed aesthetic improvement. As numerous surveys have confirmed, this means that the newer schema consists of less popular kinds of modifications. One of the biggest differences between moral and cosmetic enhancement is that making someone more compassionate or less aggressive is usually presented as a benefit to those around them. In contrast, making someone more attractive or taller is described as a positional good, one that makes those around the modified person comparatively worse off or puts them under pressure to purchase better enhancements themselves. Next, although articles on gene editing rarely include detailed scenarios of the future, these two paradigms are clearly linked to different visions of society. Indeed, some of the most prominent scientists in the early debate favored collective benefits partly because they were outspoken socialists. The manifesto I quoted explicitly condemns individualism, and its author H.J. Muller even moved to the USSR at one point. Like others from his era, he imagined gene editing as a project for all humanity, taking place on a massive scale and over a long time frame. More recent stakeholders tend to describe genome editing as if it were simply a new option for clients within the contemporary capitalistic fertility industry, without considering other futuristic changes in the world. Finally, psychology studies find that people usually see changes to morality as the most likely to affect personal identity. In contrast, the most common example of cosmetic editing in my study was eye color, which is often cited in philosophy as precisely the kind of shallow change that would leave identity unaffected. Thus, in more recent publications, both society and individuals change less. These themes can help us to speculate about possible reasons for the shifting schema. Only all but a handful of the documents I reviewed were published after World War II, when eugenics had lost much of its appeal. As sociologist Kingsley Davis noted in 1966, only famous scientists could still promote ambitious genetic improvement schemes at the time without jeopardizing their careers. Although eugenics supporters like Muller and Huxley continued to be major contributors to the discussion, as they passed away, they were replaced by younger authors with different interests, ones who had backgrounds not just in laboratory science, but in humanities like theology and the new discipline of bioethics. Historical circumstances like the Cold War could also have played a role. Nobel Prize winner Joshua Lederberg said in 1969 that the world's biggest problem was the avoidance of war, and that genetic engineering could help prevent nuclear conflict by removing personality problems and emotional disturbances. Similar arguments were employed by quite a few scientists who may have spent less time thinking about moral enhancement when those fears began to ease. Another possibility is that compassion seemed more important when debate participants imagined genetically modified people almost entirely as male. Joshua Lederberg described images from the 60s as overwhelmingly male-oriented, and Muller at times described compassion in gendered language as virile, broadly based comradeliness. Masculine imagery may have made it seem even more important to consider the military context and the avoidance of war. Underlying some of these reasons was a shift in the style of the debate, as described by sociologist John H. Evans in his book, Playing God. The 1970s saw the beginning of a move from what Max Weber would classify as substantive rationality to a formal rationality more useful to government commissions. Rather than debating the proper goals of human society, it focused more on calculating the most effective means to pragmatic ends chosen by consensus. These included beneficence, distributive justice, and especially autonomy, which was in the process of becoming a central principle of bioethics. More utopian aims may have been difficult to accommodate in such arguments, leaving the question of human relationships more to authors influenced by theology and by feminist thought. The 1970s also saw the rise of the fertility industry, as the first commercial sperm bank opened in Minneapolis in 1970, and Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, was born in 1978. As state-sponsored eugenics faded from view and assisted reproduction became increasingly popular, authors may have found it more relevant to allude to aesthetic choices like selecting sperm donors with a particular height or skin tone. Concurrently, the growth of the biotechnology industry and shift toward private funding of science may have bolstered a more commercial, capitalistic vision of human germline genome editing. Besides helping us to reassess our standard images of genome editing, learning why authors gradually discussed some modifications more than others could improve public engagement by helping us understand what trends lead people to focus on different kinds of modifications and enhancements. These trends could even give us clues about which kinds of gene editing people might pursue in the future. In order to begin looking at the views of the public and which modifications they expected most, I conducted a study in 2 steps that was published in New Genetics and Society. First, I used newspaper coverage to determine the most frequently mentioned uses of genome editing in contemporary media. I conducted a study of North Americans' views on each member of that list, asking whether respondents supported those uses and whether they thought these would be likely within the next 20 years. I chose this time frame because psychology studies find that most people rarely imagine greater distances into the future and say that they cannot see any further than 20 years of clarity. After graphing the results, I found a very strong correlation between perceived likelihood and acceptability, as you can see in this diagonal arrangement. Modifications to personality, sexual orientation, cosmetic appearance, and new abilities were all seen as undesirable and unlikely, while uses for gene therapy, infertility, and genetic diseases were the opposite. Because data from Pew Research suggests that the public thinks prohibitions will be ineffective in constraining gene editing, it seems less likely that perceived acceptability affects perceived plausibility than that perceived plausibility affects perceived acceptability. That is to say, people find it easier to see benefits of technology that seem realistic and harms from technologies that seem distant. As an explanation for this correlation, I drew in my social psychology research and specifically on construal level theory. This approach is particularly useful in the genome editing debate because both proponents and opponents of human germline editing have accused each other of over-abstraction. Experiments in construal level look at the relationship between abstraction and psychological distance, which includes aspects of temporal distance, meaning when an imagined scenario is further in the future or past, hypothetical distance, meaning when it is less likely, and social distance, meaning when it is less similar to our own situations. These are each strongly associated with the debate on germline gene editing, which is often framed as futuristic, affecting distant generations, and restricted to the ultra-wealthy. One outcome of this resulting abstraction is that people rely more heavily on schemas, such as the short lists of common Persemes discussed in the previous manuscript. Another effect is that people pay less attention to context and to details of feasibility, instead focusing on core rationales or ideological objections like playing God, as our survey data suggests. A good example comes from Sarah Franklin and Celia Roberts' ethnography Born and Made, which observed that faraway images of designer babies and the relentless focus on the future drowned out the views and emotions of people who had actually experienced pre-implantation genetic testing up close. A major contributor to this temporal, hypothetical, and social distance is that many scholars allude to science fiction books and films, although they rarely examine their narratives or future world building in sufficient detail to add concreteness to the debate. This slide, drawn from my research for an article I published in BMJ Medical Humanities, shows the most commonly referenced science fiction novels in the human germline genome editing debate. Brave New World is by far the most frequent, followed in descending order by Frankenstein, the film Gattaca, 1984, Blade Runner, Star Trek, Olaf Stapleton's brilliant but less well-known novel The Last and First Man, which follows human evolution billions of years into the future, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, and the book and movie of Ira Levin's Nazi cloning thriller The Boys from Brazil. Even when not explicitly referencing science fiction, scholars observe that so many of the same tropes, analogies, practices of future extrapolation, and strategies of emotional engagement appear within the genome editing debate that it is essentially written in the mode of science fiction. The texts I examined in my research are a great example of what literary critic Istvan Csikszentmihalyi Jr. described as science fictionality, a mode of response to incongruous aspects of contemporary reality in which the observer frames and tests experiences as if they were aspects of a work of science fiction, following its style of estrangement and dislocation. Nevertheless, the authors involved in the debate often draw an explicit rhetorical dichotomy between science fiction and fact, identifying sci-fi with unreality. In cases where fiction prefigured actual breakthroughs, these authors simply describe the technology as having moved between the two categories rather than reality becoming more science fictional. Heavy uses of science fiction references and reading the bioethical arguments themselves as science fiction both contribute to the debate's sense of distance and abstraction. One of the implications of psychological distance and abstraction is that they can lead people to favor Persemes over more concrete references to specific genes or to evocative life plans that may be based in a specific social context. As Kurt Bayards argues in his book Genetics, the further forward we imagine, the more empty and arbitrary the social purposes of genetically enhanced Persemes seem to become, leading us to focus on the Persemes themselves. In my next manuscript, Modular Ontologies for Genetically Modified People and Their Bioethical Implications, I move from looking at the content of the schemas that people use for genetically modified people to the actual form of those schemas, looking at the implied relationship between the modifications and the future person. More specifically, I looked at how Persemes are combined into what I call the modular conceptual framework for genetically modified people, which is used by both supporters and opponents of genome editing. A good introduction to this framework is to consider some of the popular visuals used for this technology. Cover artists for The Spectator and The Economist both depicted babies with arrows pointing to different parts of their bodies, labeled with different traits like boy please, perfect pitch, and not ginger. Time magazine's cover art depicted a baby fragmented kaleidoscopically into triangles, and the photographer commissioned for the piece commented that her purpose in visualizing CRISPR was to create an image that doesn't add up to a continuous human form. Similarly, the header for the influential MIT Technology Review article, Engineering the Perfect Baby by Antonio Regalado, depicted a baby's face made out of dozens of small floating spheres. Finally, Scientific American used this illustration of a hand selecting pictures of different isolated body parts. In his retracted article on the ethics of gene editing, Pajankui complained explicitly about this trope of discombobulated babies, which he may have seen as a barrier to acceptance in genome editing. My central argument in Modular Ontologies for Genetically Modified People is that these images seem appropriate because the Persemes that stakeholders tend to imagine genetically modifying in future people are conceptualized akin to Lego bricks or building blocks, like reified entities that scientists can assemble into a future child. In the manuscript, I made three major claims about that framework. First, it presents traits as modules independent from each other, ignoring biological connections between them, such as through epistasis, as well as conceptual blurriness between them, and assuming that each can be manipulated independent of the modified person's other Persemes. This tendency can also obscure the possibility that Persemes would be chosen together due to the influence of more holistic images or stereotypes. Second, the modular framework presents Persemes as biologically and ontologically similar to each other, similar to the way that physical, mental, and social traits were flattened together in early 20th century eugenics texts. This tendency draws on the geneticization of vastly different conditions, as discussed earlier in this presentation, making them all seem as though they could be addressed by the discipline of gene therapy. It can also result in the temporal flattening of all persemes into the modified embryo, even if they appear at different times of life, and this can obscure the developmental process. Lastly, the modular framework treats persemes as things that exist internal to the modified individual, rather than as social constructs or categories that link them to others through resemblances. This reinforces the minimalism of genome editing scenarios that assume an individual expert designer can treat the embryo like a doctor or mechanic, and can exclude the involvement of other groups like family members, religious leaders, genetic counselors, funders, and other parties who might influence the choice of traits. This diagram illustrates roughly what I described when writing about the modular model. Future people's traits are generally discussed as if they were separate from each other, co-equal without inherent hierarchies, and enclosed within the genetically modified person. In order to determine which those components might be, I drew further on construal level theory and the idea of basic level abstraction, which represents the level of specificity that is most cognitively efficient in everyday life. Just as apple is more convenient than the vaguer category fruit or the overly detailed Granny Smith apple, social psychology research by John et al. Shows that commonly mentioned traits like intelligence and kindness both represent basic level categories. Here, I suggest that the category of genetic modification represents the superordinate level of abstraction, that processing speed is one example of a subordinate level endophenotype, and that intelligence represents the basic level between them. These basic level traits are assembled by an expert as if they were assembling the parts of an object, based on the discrete functions that the designer wishes to add to the object. When describing entire people, stereotypes tend to be imagined at the basic level as well. Here, I use the example of genetically modified person as the most abstract category, genetically modified musician as the basic level, and genetically modified violinist as the subordinate category. Because basic level categories are distinguished based on their perceptually salient and functional parts, and because language like genetic engineering and science fiction framing often imply that genetically modified people are artificial in some way, I argue that the modular framework treats persemes as functioning parts of genetically modified people, rather than as superordinate categories those people belong to. That is to say, scholars in this debate imagine intelligence is part of a classical musician, rather than a classical musician is a kind of intelligent person. The modular framework for genetically modified people has many implications for bioethics. First, thinking about genetically modified people in terms of a conventionalized list of independent capacities appears to support objectivist theories of well-being, which argue that consequentialist ethical theories should try to promote many distinct objective aspects of the good life, like intellectual accomplishment and artistic enjoyment, rather than things like happiness or the fulfillment of people's desires, which depend on the genetically modified person's own attitudes. By focusing on certain traits, bioethicists and other scholars may create the impression that those are valuable for human flourishing. For instance, using genome editing to make people stronger or faster could lead us to think that those aspects of sport are more important, while undervaluing things like teamwork or fair play, and suggest that more resources be devoted to the former. Because there's no overarching principle to determine what is included in the objective list, bioethicists often attempt to resolve the question of which genetic modifications are appropriate by focusing on autonomy. They ask, I saw the message about my time being up, I'll just make it to the end of the slide. They ask whether persemes are natural primary goods, beneficial in any world, like intelligence or disease resistance, which are neutral differences like eye color or sexual orientation, and which might reduce the modified person's autonomy by forcing them to commit to a particular life plan, such as basketball player or astronaut. This reinforces the debate's focus on, since I clicked on the chat, I can't move the next, there we go. This reinforces the debate's focus on individual capacities rather than on how genetically modified people might fit into social, political, and economic organizations for the future, and promotes a neutralist liberal political philosophy similar to that of John Rawls, which is rejected by many opponents of human germline genome editing. The modular framework also treats persemes as fungible commodities that belong to individuals like personal property or like consumer products. The idea that modifications might be safe and effective enough to have significant monetary value leads many scholars, and especially proponents of genome editing, to focus on distributive justice. For example, George Church has stated that when people talk about the ethics of CRISPR, 90% of it should be, and probably is, about equal distribution of expensive technology. Persemes associated with natural primary goods are presented as inherently desirable commodities that are being withheld from the poor. I also have slides on a few other manuscripts, but I don't need to go into them, and I can bring them up if someone in the discussion mentions something that uh, refers to something that I have something on in one of the other manuscripts that I've published. So I'll conclude there.
Thank you very much, Derek. That was excellent. A lot to digest in a short amount of time. Uh, any questions on Derek to get us started on Derek's talk? Did you observe, Derek, to get us started maybe? You talked about how the focus of how people visualize the potential of gene editing to modify different things and evolve over time. I would actually be intrigued to know if in the since the CRISPR babies were born, if there's been some change in the recent and in the post-COVID period. I'm almost tempted to say that maybe these two sort of breakthrough event started maybe a new shift in thinking, and I was wondering if that's something that you thought about or looked into.
That is a great question. Unfortunately, because the paper in question was published in 2020, it's the time period of the articles that I looked at in order to calculate the changing ratios between different categories ended in 2019. So basically, right after the Hegenkwi experiment. I think it would definitely be interesting to step forward and look a bit about whether things like communicable disease resistance, and I guess specifically things like HIV resistance or resistance to COVID specifically, were being mentioned in articles published after that point. But unfortunately, um, that's where the chronological cutoff for the paper that I published in 2020 on the topic was. But I definitely agree that it's a really interesting um, topic for further research, and I wouldn't be surprised if people have talked a bit more about those sorts of modifications since then.
Yeah, and it sort of made CRISPR also, I think, much more tangible than it ever was before for people. So I think that's something you really would want to maybe look into since you're the first one that did this sort of thing. Yeah, be a nice follow-up. Any other questions on Derek's talk?
I see a couple of raised hands.
Oh, Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks for fascinating walk through some of your work in this area. There's a lot there. So I might just start with where you ended because that's the thing that's the most fresh in my mind. I mean, there probably other things that I was thinking earlier, but most recently you were talking about the connection to objective list theories of well-being. I was wondering if you think that is the best explanation for why those that sort of modular approach is being advanced, and whether or not what you've read would also be potentially compatible, I would think, with other theories of well-being, like desire fulfillment theory of well-being, because it seems like most of the things that are on the list are things that people want, and that the explanation for why we would be editing somebody to have them would be equally well explained by the theory that that's what the parents want, or what the parents think the child would want, or what most people would want, rather than thinking that those things were somehow objectively good. Because an objective list theory of well-being might support enhancing for traits that people don't want. And I'd sort of be surprised if there was anything on the list that aren't the types of things that people normally want. So yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe say a bit more about how you drew that connection.
Yeah, so definitely when I say that I think that the modular framework is kind of influencing the use of objective list theory, it has to come with an asterisk, which is that um, based on surveys of philosophers, objective list theory is already the most common theory that philosophers affiliate with. Um, so when I say that I think it's supporting it, I do think that it's likely that it would have been the most common approach regardless. But I think there's a couple reasons why, in the specific context of human germline genome editing, things um, like hedonism or desire fulfillment theory struggle a bit. And some of them have to do with the way in which future people are imagined based on this sort of ontology. But others actually, I think, have to do with the science fiction framing of the debate that I mentioned earlier, because as I mentioned, by far the most common framing element that people use to introduce themes into the debate is Brave New World. And part of the basic premise of Brave New World, as you know, is that, well, if we can change the biology of future people, we can create people who are happy to do, whatever role in society we want them to do, even if it's just being like a janitor. And we can create people who have very, simple and easy to achieve desires. So when we're talking about a debate in which the single most common cultural reference is Brave New World, it becomes a little bit harder to say we need to just make sure that people's desires are being met, because it's in the context of, in many cases, the the sort of awareness of this dystopian scenario where we in the present get to pick what future people will want, and that's one of the problems with standpoint, of course, that I mentioned briefly when I talked about the commonly mentioned impediments to bioethical progress, which is, well, um, how do we ensure that ethical deliberations that we make now are going to be applicable to people if we end up significantly changing their cognitive capacities or their personalities, so they're not necessarily the same as ours in the present. So I guess to sum up, I think, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think um, a lot of the reason that objective list theory is kind of there to be um, associated with these sort of specific capacities, these independent capacities, is because it lets philosophers, bioethicists, and whoever say, um, we at least have something that we can ground uh, claims in terms of, we have to make sure that future people can do this, or they're not inhibited from doing that, in a way that hedonism and desire fulfillment kind of struggle with, due to the sort of problem of putting ourselves in the subjective shoes of people whose subjectivity we might be able to tinker with, as the sort of the Brave New World like thematic
Derek,
framing keeps reinforcing.
I'm going to stop you, Derek, just so that we have time for one more. Thank you, though. It was a great question, Jeff, and good answer, Derek. Very interesting. Gilberto, please go ahead with your last question.
Yeah, thank you. While I'm still digesting the content, Derek, I have a question, which is a massive digression. Uh, I don't know whether you've heard of the head transplant operation that was once proposed by a Italian neurosurgeon. For example, someone can preserve his head and therefore his memory, and personhood, and then get a young body, healthy body. Now, there are many criticisms about it, and one of which is about disembodiment, that whether changing your body while preserving your brain uh, actually changes your identity and personhood. Now, it's not exactly the same as what you're talking about, but I think some similar issues can become relevant. I just want to ambush you with this little sort of digression. Yeah, thank you.
That's interesting for sure. I think it actually brings up the thing that I had been going to introduce just briefly. This is just one of the kind of side um, bits that I published, but wasn't going to be actually one of the chapters of my thesis. But basically, it's a study that we did of asking people how much they thought that different types of genetic modifications would affect whether a future person felt like they would have been the same person as they would have been without the modification. And if you, what I did was in this figure, I marked the ones that seemed mostly mental in blue and the ones that seemed mostly physical in red. And while there's sort of some clusters on either side that have things that everyone thinks, oh, like this would make such a big effect on my identity. Oh, this if I was right-handed as opposed to left-handed, it wouldn't make that much of a difference. In the center, there's kind of an interesting pattern where there's mostly mental ones that are perceived to have kind of a larger effect on identity than the ones on the left, which are mostly physical, with the exception of um, therapeutic modifications. So I think that definitely when we look at the data that we have on what people at least think about genetic modification, it's definitely the case that there's sort of a kind of a Cartesian dualist sort of vibe, and that people think that things that refer to psychological properties are more pertinent to the continuity of identity than physical ones. At least that's the pattern that I read in the center part of this graph. So I think that that observation is definitely relevant to my work.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.